At 0700 on July 19, 1945, a submarine sat just beneath the surface of the northern edge of Japan, moving slowly through cold water that looked empty because it had been emptied. Through the periscope, the coastline of Karafuto lay in muted tones, dark rock, pale surf, low hills that held no obvious targets, no ships at anchor, no columns of smoke. The war was still on the calendar, still killing men on maps and islands. But out here, the usual signs of it had thinned to almost nothing. That absence was not peace. It was a kind of pressure. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific had been methodically stripped of what submarines were built to hunt. The merchant lanes that once fed Japan's war machine had been cut, and cut again until there were fewer convoys to intercept, fewer silhouettes on the horizon, fewer radio reports of predictable traffic. The ocean had become a wide, silent space where a crew could spend days listening to water and machinery and the distant creak of hull plating, waiting for a target that might never appear. A submarine's advantage was invisibility. Its weakness was time. Every day at sea was a day measured in fuel, batteries, food, and the quiet strain of men living in a sealed metal tube. Even on a successful patrol, there was a limit. Orders gave a window. Schedules demanded return. The enemy did not have to defeat the submarine directly if the submarine simply ran out of opportunities before it ran out of supplies. That was the arithmetic that hung over the command. The boat itself was a large Gato-class submarine, built for long-range patrols, heavy enough to endure depth-charge attacks and spacious by submarine standards, but still cramped in every way that mattered. 80 men lived inside it. They slept in shifts, ate when they could, and worked amid constant vibration and damp air. There was no privacy, no silence, no true darkness. The ship's systems breathed and hummed around them day and night. The smell of diesel, oil, sweat, and a supply line that could be seen, predicted, and timed. The commander watched it in silence. There was a procedural rhythm to observation. You did not act on a single sighting. You confirmed. You counted. You tracked patterns and schedules. You worked the problem until the fog of uncertainty thinned into something a crew could plan around. Because planning was how submarines survived. A rushed decision made on instinct could cost the boat and everyone aboard. So he watched. One train, then another later. Not random, not one-off. A repeated movement along the same corridor, carrying something that mattered enough to justify rail traffic this close to the coast. In 1945, nothing moved without purpose. Fuel was scarce. Resources were scarce. Every shipment was a choice made by a nation under siege. That was why the commander kept watching, because in that movement, he could feel the outline of an opportunity and also the shape of a problem that did not have an easy solution. A train was not a ship. It could not be stalked in open water. It could not be torpedoed. It could be shelled, perhaps, but rails could be repaired. And the crew could not spend its last patrol simply damaging things that would be fixed before morning. The mission demanded disruption that lasted. The periscope moved again, slow and deliberate. The sea remained empty. No masts, no wakes, no silhouettes that would justify the standard attack procedures drilled into every man aboard. The war had moved into a different phase. And on this coast, in this hour, the commander was forced to confront a hard truth that no training manual solved. When conventional targets disappear, the mission does not end. It only changes its demands. It forces a commander to either accept irrelevance or find a way to strike where submarines were never meant to strike. He did not make that decision yet. Not at 0700. Not in this first quiet hour where observation still mattered more than action. But the pressure was already forming, because the patrol clock was still running, and somewhere along that railroad, another train would come. The periscope stayed raised longer than usual. Inside the conning tower, the submarine felt smaller than it had hours earlier, compressed not by depth, but by responsibility. The commander stood with one hand resting lightly against a metal housing, his eye fixed to the lens, turning the scope a few degrees at a time. The motion was slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. It was how submarines searched when there was nothing obvious to find. Below him, 80 men lived inside the hull. They slept, worked, ate, and waited, trusting that the man at the periscope would decide when the waiting ended and when the danger began. That trust was not ceremonial. It was practical. Every order he gave shaped whether they would surface into daylight, dive into depth charges, or return home having changed nothing at all. Command at sea was lonely in ways that did not show on paper. The submarine had no bridge crowded with officers, no open horizon where decisions were shared by glances and shouted confirmations. Here, information came through instruments, reports, and a narrow slice of the world viewed through glass. The commander absorbed it all alone, then translated it into orders that everyone else obeyed without debate. The war had trained him to be decisive. It had not trained him for stagnation. Patrol fatigue did not announce itself loudly. It crept in through repetition, long stretches of silence, reports that ended with nothing to contact, days where the boat maneuvered perfectly, maintained stealth, conserved fuel, and accomplished nothing measurable. Success, once defined by ships sunk and tonnage destroyed, now risked being reduced to simply returning intact. That reduction felt dangerous, not because survival lacked value, but because the war was not over. Men were still dying elsewhere because supplies reached Japanese garrisons that had not yet been cut off. Every train that moved unchallenged represented rifles, ammunition, food, and resolve arriving where American planners hoped weakness would set in first. The commander knew that arithmetic as well as anyone in headquarters. But arithmetic alone did not produce solutions at sea. He turned the periscope again and found the coastline unchanged. Hills, surf, track, empty stretches of land that did not acknowledge the submarine watching from just offshore. It was frustrating in a way that did not lend itself to anger. The enemy was not taunting him. The environment itself was simply offering fewer options. That was the hardest kind of pressure. Doctrine existed to simplify decisions. Submarines attacked ships. They avoided shallow water unless absolutely necessary. They did not risk surfacing close to defended coasts without overwhelming justification. Those rules had been written in blood, refined patrol by patrol, to maximize the odds that a submarine would survive long enough to fight again. But doctrine assumed the presence of targets that fit the rules. Here, the rules felt increasingly mismatched to the war as it now existed. The commander lowered the periscope briefly, letting the world above vanish. The conning tower lights hummed softly. Someone nearby adjusted a gauge. The submarine continued moving at slow speed, its course steady, its engines restrained to minimize noise. He did not need to look at the crew to feel their expectations. Submariners were professionals, but they were not indifferent. They knew how many patrols remained. They knew how close the war was to ending. They knew that this patrol, possibly the last, would define how they remembered their service. Doing nothing was not neutral. If the boat returned having found no targets, the report would be clean. No losses, no incidents, no deviation from orders. It would also be a silent admission that the submarine had outlived its original purpose in these waters. The commander could not accept that without exhausting every alternative. It raised the periscope again, this time lingering on the railroad. It cut through the landscape with an efficiency that stood out against the natural shapes around it. Straight lines, regular intervals, predictability. In warfare, predictability was always an invitation. It was why convoys were vulnerable, why patrol routes changed, why timetables were guarded. And yet this line ran openly, day and night. The trains were not escorted by destroyers or aircraft. They did not zigzag. They could not. They followed the rails wherever they led. They represented a kind of certainty that naval warfare rarely allowed. The problem was not identifying the target. The problem was admitting that the platform he commanded was not designed to exploit it. A submarine commander could not call for air support. He could not redirect surface forces. His entire toolkit was contained within the steel hull beneath his feet. Torpedoes, a deck gun, rockets, if fitted, stealth, surprise, withdrawal. None of those fit cleanly with a moving land target. And yet, the trains kept running. The commander felt the weight of every man aboard when he considered that mismatch. 80 lives meant 80 families waiting at home. It meant 80 chances for a mistake to echo far beyond this coast. Risk could not be theoretical. It had to be justified in terms that would still make sense if the submarine did not come back. This was the illusion that command stripped away early, that bravery could substitute for planning, or that reputation could shield a man from consequence. Past patrols did not make future ones safer. Medals did not deflect depth charges. The sea recognized only physics, timing, and error. He ignored the thought of his own record deliberately. Whatever he had done before mattered less than what he chose now. This patrol existed on its own terms. The boat did not care who commanded it. The enemy did not care either. The coastline would punish miscalculation without regard for rank or history. The commander stayed at the periscope because leaving it felt like surrender. Not surrender to the enemy, but surrender to irrelevance. As long as he watched, the problem remained alive. As long as the problem remained alive, there was still a chance to solve it. He considered the constraints again, one by one, as if laying them out might reveal a gap. The water was shallow. Surfacing close to shore risked detection and eliminated the option of a rapid dive. Japanese patrols existed, even if they were not visible now. Any action that required time on the surface multiplied exposure. Any action that involved leaving the submarine multiplied risk exponentially. And yet, submarines had evolved because commanders were willing to accept calculated risk when the alternative was strategic stagnation. He did not romanticize that thought. He measured it. Calculated risk meant knowing what could not be controlled and deciding whether the remaining uncertainty was acceptable. It meant asking whether the mission's value outweighed the potential loss of the boat. It meant confronting the possibility that doing nothing might be safer and deciding whether safety alone was a sufficient objective. The periscope view blurred slightly as the submarine rolled in the swell. He steadied it and continued scanning. Another stretch of track. No train this time. The schedule was not constant. That uncertainty mattered too. Timing would never be perfect. It rarely was. The commander exhaled slowly and rested his forehead briefly against the periscope housing, not in fatigue, but in focus. This was the moment when illusion fell away. There was no obvious solution waiting to be discovered. There was only a choice between accepting limits and attempting to redefine them. He knew that redefining them would require others. The crew would have to be involved. Specialists, men with ideas that did not exist in manuals. It would require trust flowing in both directions, not just orders flowing downward. That realization did not yet turn into a plan. For now, it simply reframed the patrol. The submarine was not failing because it had nothing to sink. It was being tested because the war had moved beyond the boundaries the submarine had been designed for. Whether that test ended in innovation or restraint would depend entirely on the next decisions made in this quiet steel chamber. The commander lowered the periscope once more. The coastline disappeared. Below the surface, the boat continued on course, silent and intact, carrying 80 men who did not yet know how close they were to being asked for something submarines had never been asked to do before. The decision did not arrive as a flash of inspiration. It emerged slowly, pressed into shape by constraint. Inside the submarine, charts were spread across the plotting table, their edges curling slightly in the damp air. Coastlines traced in thin ink. depth contours marked with numbers that mattered more than any target designation. The railroad was there in black and white, a line running parallel to the shore, close enough to the water to be tempting and far enough inland to be dangerous. Everyone who looked at it understood the same thing immediately. The submarine could not destroy it from the sea. The deck-gun lacked precision. At that distance, rounds would tear up gravel and ties, nothing more. Repairs would begin within hours. Rockets, even if fired accurately, scattered their impact. They were built to burn and disrupt, not to strike a moving point target with certainty. Torpedoes were irrelevant. They belonged to another domain entirely. If the train was to be destroyed, it would require contact. That word hung unspoken in the room. Contact meant exposure. It meant abandoning the greatest advantage a submarine possessed: invisibility. It meant moving from a war of shadows into a war of footsteps, breath, and sound. It meant acknowledging that steel and machinery had reached their limits, and that the next step, if there was one, would belong to men. The manuals did not address this scenario. Submarine doctrine assumed the enemy existed on the water or beneath it. Shore bombardment was a risk tolerated under specific conditions. Landing parties were not contemplated at all. Putting men ashore on enemy home territory violated not only procedure but assumption. Submarines were hunters, not carriers of infantry. Their crews were sailors, not saboteurs. And yet the railroad remained. The commander listened as his officers outlined the obvious dangers, not because he needed reminding, but because the act of stating them imposed discipline on the thought process. Shallow water limited maneuverability. Surfacing so close to shore increased the chance of detection by patrols, aircraft, or civilians. If the submarine were caught on the surface, there would be no time to dive safely. Damage at that range would be catastrophic. If men went ashore, the risks multiplied. They would be operating without support, without reinforcement, without the protections afforded to uniformed combatants in conventional battle. If captured, they would not be treated as prisoners of war. Sabotage behind lines carried a different penalty. Everyone in the room understood what that penalty was. No amount of planning could remove that fact. Time was another enemy. Any shore party would be working against a clock measured not in hours, but in minutes. The submarine could not wait indefinitely. Tide shifted. Patrol patterns changed. Dawn approached whether the mission was complete or not. Extraction would be as dangerous as insertion, and failure at either stage would leave men stranded in territory they could not hope to escape on foot. The commander did not interrupt. He let the risks accumulate until there was no illusion left that cleverness alone could solve them. This was not a problem that yielded to optimization. It was a problem that demanded acceptance of irreducible danger. Only then did the conversation change. Not to how they could eliminate the risk, but to whether the risk was justified. The railroad fed forces preparing to resist an invasion that everyone knew was coming. Each train represented momentum the enemy could still generate. Destroying one train would not end the war. It would not cripple the enemy, but it would disrupt certainty. It would force resources to be diverted, patrols reassigned, assumptions questioned. The value lay not just in destruction, but in surprise. A submarine placing men ashore on Japanese home territory was something the enemy did not expect, because it did not fit any existing pattern. Surprise, in warfare, was often worth more than firepower. The commander understood that. He also understood that surprise came at a cost borne by individuals, not abstractions. When he finally spoke, it was not to announce a plan, but to ask a question that carried weight precisely because it was not rhetorical. If they attempted this, would they do so in a way that preserved control, discipline, and the possibility, however narrow, of extraction? Or would they drift into improvisation that turned risk into recklessness? The distinction mattered. Recklessness wasted lives. Calculated rupture accepted risk for a defined purpose. The solution, when it began to take shape, was deliberately modest. No large force, no attempt to occupy ground. A small party. Enough men to carry equipment, provide security, and withdraw quickly. Nothing more. The goal was not confrontation. It was absence, arrive unseen, act decisively, vanish. That constraint was not imposed by caution alone. It was imposed by reality. The submarine could not spare more men without degrading its own ability to fight or survive. The beach could not conceal a larger group. The operation had to fit within the limits of darkness and silence. Every element was measured against what could not be controlled. Weather, for instance, was not something they could dictate. Moonlight mattered. Cloud cover mattered. Surf conditions mattered. A calm sea could turn rough without warning, and rubber rafts did not forgive mistakes. A capsized raft would scatter men and equipment in seconds. Enemy patrols followed patterns, but patterns changed. Dogs were used along some rail sections. Civilians might appear unexpectedly. A single light, a single voice, a single misstep could unravel the entire effort. There were also the men themselves. The commander insisted on criteria that felt almost anachronistic. Physical fitness was obvious. Swimming ability was non-negotiable. Skills mattered: electrical knowledge, mechanical understanding, navigation. But beyond that, he looked for something harder to quantify: restraint. The men chosen would need to operate under extreme pressure without the release of combat. No firing unless absolutely necessary. No improvisation that risked exposure. The discipline to remain unseen even when discovery seemed imminent. This was not a mission for those seeking action. It was a mission for those who could tolerate stillness. Volunteers were asked for, but volunteering alone was not enough. Selection was deliberate. The commander weighed not just competence, but what failure would mean for each man beyond the immediate. He excluded those with families depending on them, not out of sentimentality, but because command stripped away the luxury of pretending consequences ended at the shoreline. When the final list was set, it was smaller than many expected. No speeches accompanied the announcement. The men chosen did not celebrate. They listened, asked practical questions, and began preparing. Those not chosen returned to their duties without resentment. Submarine crews understood division of labor. Not every task belonged to everyone. The device itself, the means of destruction, was simple by necessity. There was no time or capacity for elaborate engineering. It had to be reliable, compact, and unforgiving. The plan relied on physics more than precision: weight, pressure, inevitability. The train would trigger its own destruction by existing. That simplicity was intentional. Complexity introduced failure points. In an environment where failure meant capture or death, elegance mattered less than certainty. As preparations continued, the commander remained distant but attentive. He did not hover. He did not encourage bravado. He watched for signs of doubt or hesitation, not to eliminate them, but to ensure they were acknowledged. Fear unspoken became fear unmanaged. The night of execution approached without ceremony. Cloud cover developed slowly, the kind that could just as easily dissipate as thicken. The commander waited longer than was comfortable, knowing that impatience would undermine the very caution the plan depended on. When the conditions finally aligned, not perfectly, but sufficiently, he made the call. There was no turning back after that. Orders were given quietly. Rafts were readied. Equipment was checked and rechecked. The submarine altered course and reduced speed, slipping closer to shore than doctrine ever intended. Depth gauges were watched carefully. Numbers dropped into ranges that left no margin for error. The commander stood in the conning tower and felt the weight of the decision settle fully for the first time. Once the men left the deck, the submarine would be committed. If something went wrong ashore, there would be no rescue force. If the boat were detected, diving might not be possible. The choice he had made could not be corrected mid-course. That was the nature of the rupture. It was not dramatic. It was not impulsive. It was a clean break from what submarines were supposed to do: driven by the recognition that the war no longer conformed to those expectations. As the raft slipped into the water and paddles dipped silently beneath the surface, the commander did not watch with pride or fear. He watched with clarity. The men were not acting because of his reputation or his past. They were acting because the situation demanded something beyond routine. Whether that demand was justified would be determined not by history, but by whether they returned. The shoreline loomed closer, dark and indistinct. The submarine remained on the surface, exposed, waiting. From this moment on, success or failure would hinge not on firepower, but on time, silence, and the irreversible choice to ask sailors to do something no manual had ever prepared them for. The explosion itself lasted only a moment. From the submarine, it appeared as a brief, violent interruption in the darkness along the coast. A sudden bloom of light. A column of fire and debris rising where moments before there had been nothing but rails and shadow. The sound reached the boat seconds later, a deep concussion that carried across the water and echoed back from the land. Then the night closed in again. The submarine did not linger. It could not afford to. Engines turned. Course adjusted. The boat moved away from the shore while the glow still flickered faintly behind it. There was no confirmation beyond what the men had seen with their own eyes. No report, no signal. Just the knowledge that the train was gone and that the coastline would not remain quiet for long. Searchlights appeared within minutes. Thin white beams cut across the water, probing, sweeping, searching for a shape they knew must be there. The enemy did not yet know what had happened, only that something unprecedented had occurred. A train destroyed inland without warning. No aircraft overhead. No surface ships visible. The assumption that the sea was a boundary had been broken. That confusion bought time. The submarine reached deeper water and slipped beneath the surface, trading speed for invisibility. Below, the hull settled into the familiar rhythm of submerged travel. Electric motors hummed. The sea pressed in from all sides. Above them, the search continued, increasingly frantic and increasingly blind. The men who had gone ashore sat silently where they had been ordered, wet, cold, and exhausted. There was no celebration, no release. Adrenaline faded quickly, replaced by the dull weight of survival. They were back aboard, alive, but the cost of that survival would not be calculated immediately. War rarely allowed for immediate accounting. By morning, the submarine was gone from the area. The coast returned to its routines under new tension. Guards were posted where none had been before. Patrols increased. Inspections became frequent. Resources shifted quietly, not in panic, but in recognition that an assumption had been violated.